Dr. Koh is an expert of maritime security. And maybe let's start by Dr. Koh explain to us, how did you get involved in this subject? What did you major in your studies, and how did you arrive to this very niche subject?
Okay, maybe many of our audience may not know that I actually started out not as a social scientist. I actually started out as an engineering student. I'm very interested in military, maritime affairs since the time I was studying engineering, actually. So when I go into RSIS, I sort of got exposed to much more because I used to just look at, say, tank, ships, aircraft, and all that. So from there, I started to take an interest on maritime issues. And in fact, that is my PhD thesis that I've been dealing with since 2008. That is, it has been so many years, right? So that has been my sort of lifelong passion. That's where I started. And I thought, doing a PhD to look into this issue allow me to look at maritime issues more broadly and deeply. And right now, as I'm talking, I believe you agree with me that it's a sort of a continual learning process, because maritime security and naval issues continue to evolve. I mean, there's no end to learning, and so I think I'll be doing that for a very, very long time.
Before I forget, Happy Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year.
As you know,
as you know, there is a fierce debate online at the moment about how to name this holiday. What do they call it in Singapore? Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year or?
Well, okay, firstly is that there is no mandatory way of calling it. Even in within the government, there is no uniform way of calling it. Some departments will refer to Lunar New Year, some refer to Chinese New Year, but essentially it's the same. For example, if we actually say it verbally in Mandarin, we actually just simply say, 新年快乐. So in English, we just say Happy New Year. We don't say, oh, Happy Chinese New Year, or Happy Lunar New Year, actually. So in formal setting, like for example, just today I posted online, you might have seen my tweet, actually. I was pointing out that even in the government, right, the term Chinese New Year is often used as well. In our case, it's not so sensitive because we basically, as you know, Singapore is a multiracial society. So we just name those respective festivals as they are. And in fact, there's no issue with it. So to be honest, if you ask me as a Singaporean, I tend to find this discussion, this debate about whether you should call it Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year, something somewhat puzzling to begin with. But I do understand that, for example, the Lunar New Year is celebrated in other countries, right? For example, in Korea, they don't call that Lunar New Year, right? They have another name for that. I think they call it Chuseok, right? And Vietnam celebrates its Lunar New Year. So what I tend to see is that there shouldn't be some sort of a monopolization of the term Lunar New Year. I mean, maybe we can quibble that, Chinese New Year is specifically referring to the Chinese New Year, right? But the term Lunar New Year shouldn't be somewhat appropriated as belonging to just one particular culture. So depending on the setting, for example, I will wish Lunar New Year to, say, my Vietnamese friends, or I will say Happy Tet, right? Because they call it Tet. So it really depends. So in our case, we are secular. So we tend to be a little bit more liberal in the way we refer to that, without those sort of political connotations or political baggage that usually come with it. So that's why I do find this debate online quite interesting, because I don't think many Singaporeans come across that before. Yeah.
From your vantage point in Singapore, how do you see the region's perception of China, especially in the last decades? Is there a change of attitude towards China because China's growing military and economic power and their projection of power in the South China Sea? So how do you see among policymakers and naval professionals you interact with? Is there any change of attitude?
Yeah, okay. So in Singapore, there is very often when people look at Singapore's threat perception and policies, there tend to be, I think, a sort of a very standard view that Singapore has a very unified position. I mean, largely because it has always been a one-party rule for these many decades under the People's Action Party, right? So there is always the perception and impression that there is a lot of policy consistency, and from top down, there is one unified approach to that. To some extent, it's true, but I just want to point out that in Singapore, the various stakeholders viewing China, there are many of them. Government is one. There is also the private sector. So what I'm trying to point out here is that, for example, the private sector, especially those which are, for example, associated with the Chinese clan associations in Singapore. As you might be aware, we have various Chinese clan associations that were, linked to the various specific dialect groups, like say the Fujian Hui Guan, the Guangdong Hui Guan, and all that, Kejia Hui Guan, and all that. So they have, of course, a very deep business interest in China, and they have very close Chinese links as well. But of course, they usually are the ones who are less political about it. They wouldn't really care so much about the South China Sea, to be honest. And they tend to focus on the lucrative economic links between Singapore and China. The reason why I raise this is because I won't call them lobbyists, but certainly these pretty influential business groups and clan associations, I think they do have some level of influence on policy making. So in other words, while on the other hand, they would be a moderating influence on the government when it comes to its policy towards China. So for example, the government views the Americans as the primary security partner, right? And of course, that usually leads to the sort of don't make me choose type of conundrum. On the one hand, you are close in security ties with the US, and on the other hand, you are close economically with China. So because of that, there is this what I tend to see as an artificial bifurcation. But that is, I think, in some ways, a means to balance these two great powers. Over these years, I think there is certainly some continuity and some change in the way China is being viewed. And I will list out, first of all, the consistencies. First of all is that China is a geographical constant and a fact. It's a geostrategic fact, and you can't just simply wish away China. And that also means that China's well-being is, I think, in some ways, a positive thing for Singapore and, of course, China's peripheral neighbors in Southeast Asia and, of course, the other Northeast Asian neighbors. So a stable China, which is prosperous, is a great thing for Singapore. And of course, Singapore benefited tremendously from it, from the economic sense. From the security sense, the one consistency is that China continues to be an uncertain factor. This was a case in the past. This is even more so the case today. Given what we have seen in China's domestic arena. You are aware of the PLA leadership purges, and of course, the gradual concentration of power by President Xi Jinping, and of course, the something that didn't really change, and over time it has increasingly become much more of an issue, of a trouble, is China is increasingly opaque. I give you an example. 10 years ago, for example, we will be quite happy when we have the opportunity to interact with our Chinese interlocutors. We are able to get them to come to our conferences. We can go to China. We can interact quite freely. And of course, we value the fact that we could actually talk to them on the sidelines and they can be candid with us what's going on. But the atmosphere has changed, especially under the current leadership. There is greater censorship, or I will call self-censorship. There is greater caution on the part of Chinese officials and Chinese academics to share things candidly. And I think that contributed to the opacity, and that created greater sense of uncertainty. So that is the second consistency and change at the same time. The third factor is that for sure over these many years, China has emerged to be a significant actor in not just the economic sector, but I think increasingly in the tech sector. Singapore, as you know, is smack right within Southeast Asia. We're a small country and we are quite closely integrated with our neighbors in Southeast Asia. Our neighbors, they are very much dependent on China economically and in terms of technological cooperation. So on the one hand, we want to benefit from that. On the other hand, we are also very concerned about the gradual Chinese influence in the region. Han, you might be familiar with the ICEA's Yusof Ishak Institute survey that is done annually. And I think generally, I wouldn't say that the survey 100% encapsulates how elites in Singapore or Southeast Asia view China. But I think it's quite close to reality. On the one hand, there is a recognition that over these years, China has indeed gained influence. But you might also be aware from the survey that the other finding was that at the same time, Southeast Asians, and Southeast Asian one of them, is increasingly also concerned about China's influence becoming a negative aspect. Why I say that? That this influence, if you want to see that as something positive, obviously it's more in the economic realm, but the influence can translate into something a little bit more malignant in a way, right? That, you know, there is a question about whether your sovereignty is being respected or whether China is trying to impose its will upon its neighbors. I think these concerns are legitimate. And I believe the Singapore government is cognizant of that. And of course, since you asked this question, maybe let me bring you back to what happened in 2016-17. You might be aware of the incident between Singapore and China. We had this incident revolving around the 2016 arbitral ruling on the South China Sea. And Singapore government merely issued a statement that says that we took note of the statement. We didn't even say that we endorsed any of it. But the Chinese government, they were quite incensed that Singapore actually made a statement which they saw as an endorsement of the arbitral award in favor of the Philippines. And that sets off a sort of a word war. And of course, it brings forth a bigger question within Singapore about our identity, because there is an expectation apparently in China that because Singapore is mostly Chinese population, right? We have a 70% ethnic Chinese population. So therefore we are somehow regarded by some in China as a Chinese nation. If you're yellow skin, you're supposed to support yellow skin, right? So, you know, why are you supporting the Filipinos, right? So if you're supporting Filipinos, means you are supporting the Americans. So there is expectation that Singapore should support China. And that sets forth the Terex detention incident in Hong Kong. And of course, after which there is a concern that, you know, we need to therefore impress upon the point that Singapore is not a Chinese nation. We might have a majority ethnic Chinese population, but we are after all multiracial, and we are proud to uphold that identity. So you will find that back in those days, our leaders continue to make public statements to that effect, trying to impress upon the fact that your roots might be Chinese, ancestral roots might be Chinese, but your national identity and allegiance should be to Singapore. So I think I will refer you to, for example, the 2017 or 2018 National Day Rally speech by the then Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. I think he devoted a good part of that speech just for that. And I believe the intended audience isn't just for Singaporeans, Chinese, but also for China. And of course, if I could be a little bit bolder, in the recent times, I guess there is an increasing sense of unease about what's happening in the social media and in the cyber domain when it comes to the discourse related to China in Singapore. And I think that, I believe, gave rise to various new legislations that are being put forth. For example, in particular, the Foreign Interference Countermeasures Act, or FICA, that was being put forth. And I believe the Singapore government did not specify which actor is designed for, and I don't think there's need to, but if you look at all the timing, it seems to be pointing towards China. And I guess, there is really growing a sense of unease about how this Chinese influence is gradually seeping into Singapore society, especially revolving around ethnic Chinese Singaporeans, therefore. So in a nutshell, there is a sense of optimism about China in terms of its economy and the positive spillovers. But over time, there is greater sense of uncertainty about China's intentions in the region, and of course, what China is likely doing in Singapore in terms of influencing the society. The last factor here, I'm sorry, I keep droning on this point, is that with the recent moves by the US, with the Trump administration, I guess, it might lead to a greater sense of uncertainty in Singapore. Because on the one hand, Singapore still wants to view the US as anchoring regional security with its military presence. On the other hand, there is growing sense of trepidation when it comes to US commitment to the region itself, and Trump's unpredictability, and of course the question about whether the US is still the beacon for upholding the rule of law, right? So there is that concern that may shift the region more towards China, and then that will lead to what Singapore should do and what Singapore should factor into its strategic calculus going forward. But generally, there is still a sense of optimism that the US will still be engaged in the region, and the US will still remain committed to Southeast Asia. And of course, Singapore will still maintain its links to the US, regardless of which administration it is, therefore.
It's been a huge inflow of investment and migration from the Chinese upper middle classes, and some even quite a few billionaires moving to Singapore, especially after the uncertainty in Hong Kong. How does that migration pattern influence Singapore politics and attitude toward China? Would it be a significant factor in terms of influence on Singapore's official policy towards China?
I think in some ways, I will be remiss to say that there is no influence. There's certainly going to be influence of some sort, right? It's a good thing to Southeast Asia when you have Chinese, investors who are actually exiting Chinese homeland and coming to Southeast Asia to invest. I mean, it is glad tidings for many Southeast Asian countries, not least Singapore. For a number of Southeast Asian countries, it has to do with investments in building manufacturing plants, tech transfers, and whatnot. For Singapore, to be honest, we don't really have, we are not as dependent on the type of exports that our neighbors tend to have. We don't build EVs in Singapore, and in a way, the things that we depend on China might be very different. Property, I think, is the key area where Singapore benefited from the exodus of Chinese investors, because, as you know, the property sector crisis in China isn't actually going away very soon. We do know that the Chinese government is trying to do something to it right now, but how long it will take is uncertain. But what is certain is that Chinese investors reach Chinese citizens who want to, invest in alternate property sectors, find Singapore or even Malaysia, for example, to be quite attractive options. And that, I think, is good for Singapore's economy, right? So therefore, I wouldn't be surprised that there will be corporate sectors, including the business community that I mentioned earlier in Singapore, who will be very much supportive of these Chinese influx into Singapore. And that, in some ways, will influence Singapore's policy. However, let me bring you back to what happened more than 10 years ago. More than 10 years ago, I remember that was, I think, the second time I actually voted in my life as a Singaporean citizen. That was 2011. In 2011, and in fact, even before that, there was a very intense public debate about foreign influx and the question about our identity as Singaporeans, because we do know that we have a falling birth rate, right? And we do understand that Singapore is, after all, a migrant nation to begin with. That is our roots as a migrant nation. My grandfather came from mainland China, from Fujian province, right? I'm a third generation Singaporean. So we understand that Singaporeans aren't xenophobic. Singaporeans do welcome foreigners to come to Singapore to become citizens, but then there is a question about how fast that it is taking place, and whether or not there are social economic trade-offs for locally born Singaporeans who are trying to find a job, trying to find housing. Everything became so expensive. So I think the ruling PAP hasn't forgotten this problem, which is why I raise this issue, because I think that also serves as some sort of a mitigating factor in terms of how the government views the influx of Chinese citizens and investments in Singapore. You'll be cognizant and more aware of the potential trade-offs and try to do something to it. And you are aware that in the recent times, there is quite a bit of bad press regarding Chinese presence in Singapore. For example, the big criminal case of money laundering that happened just in the recent years. And that, I think, in some ways is not necessarily seen as a good thing. That's the one. Second, that's more recent, was that there is increasingly, I think, some social media murmuring about the gradual loss of Singapore identity, even in the food and beverage culinary sector, because of the observation that we're seeing more and more Chinese mainland brands sprucing up in Singapore. I mean, in some ways, it actually contributed to our very vibrant culinary space, right? But I think there are some concerns that they are gradually sort of encroaching into Singapore and, becoming more dominant, and in some ways seen as undermining Singapore's very local identity. For example, the proliferation of maritime restaurants and eateries, and of course, mala hot pot has always been popular, and there is even the halal version of mala hot pot that was offered in Singapore to cater to the taste of non-ethnic Chinese Singapore as well, right? Especially to our Muslim community. So I think in some ways there is some sort of a welcome of Chinese influence in terms of social cultural influence, but on the other hand, I think there is certainly some groundswell concern about that, and I don't think the government is sort of oblivious to these concerns, and I think that they believe, and I believe they will preempt the possibility of that becoming an election topic in the next election, that could potentially be a sore point for the ruling party if they don't handle it properly. So therefore, I tend to be a little bit more optimistic on how the government will try to handle that, because of what I tend to see as more predominant local sensitivities towards social, economic, and social political concerns, more so than the geopolitical concerns, I would say.
Okay, so let's talk about your area of study, the China's South China Sea strategy. You have warned before that a single incident in South China Sea could have spiraled into something much bigger or much more serious. So in your view, what are the specific structural factors that make military escalation very likely today?
Well, of course, that leads us to look at what Kenneth Waltz, when he wrote his book, and he outlined the three layers or the three levels of analysis. The sort of systemic level analysis looks at the external environment, and then he went down to the second layer where he looked at the domestic environment, and then all the way down to the third level, which is the individual policy elites. The man himself. It could be Donald Trump, it could be Xi Jinping, for example. And I think all these three layers are operative at the same time, and I guess because it makes it so difficult for us to pin down on one dominant layer of analysis, so all three layers contributed to the uncertainty of potential clash in the South China Sea. Now, the first thing to note is that I believe in China, the South China Sea, insofar that unless it is linked to Taiwan, the South China Sea isn't really viewed as the most important issue. And at least that's amongst our understanding of the sentiments with the Chinese scholarly circle, and even we extrapolate it to the Chinese policy elites as well, and even down to the average Chinese citizen. who might actually not be as concerned about the South China Sea than, say, Taiwan, for instance. So the problem here is there is no way you could divorce the South China Sea from Taiwan because of the contiguity of the water body to Taiwan itself and the surrounding environment. So in other words, if there's going to be conflict in Taiwan, there's going to be something happening in the South China Sea. However, if there's something happening in the Spratly Islands, it doesn't necessarily have a knockover effect on Taiwan. So that is, I think, a more nuanced way to look at one of these structural factors. That's one. At the first broader layer of the systemic factors, right? And of course, what really also matters has to be what we see globally as well. I think with now Trump trying to sort of, be involved in various global issues, the Middle East, and of course, I think he's trying to pull away from Ukraine. On the other hand, we do see that the Trump administration appears to be more concerned about the Western Hemisphere, despite the rhetoric that we are going to be focused on the Indo-Pacific. But we try to make sense of what Trump administration is trying to do. But the issue here is still uncertainty, right? It contributed to the uncertainty as to whether Trump might, after all, be that invested in the Indo-Pacific. And even if we do acknowledge that the Trump administration is invested in the Indo-Pacific, I don't think he will be that invested in everything about the Indo-Pacific. Maybe he might be invested on Taiwan issue. On the South China Sea, I'm not too sure, honestly. Give an example. That commentary that I wrote that you mentioned came about after the second Thomas Shaw clash 2 years ago. And I wrote on this issue, and I will also argue that the uncertainty then that was during Biden administration continued to this day. Because during then, the Biden administration appeared to be more interested in trying to settle the Middle East problems than actually on Indo-Pacific. Good example would be the diversion of aircraft carrier from the Indo-Pacific to the Middle East. It wasn't a very recent phenomenon under the current Trump administration. 2 years ago, that happened as well, right? And last year, it happened again. So from these patterns, I think there is a growing sense of uncertainty as to whether there will be US commitment if, say, for example, there's a clash between the Filipinos and the Chinese over the South China Sea problem. And I believe those in Manila were very concerned about whether the Americans will fulfill their end of the bargain when it comes to the Mutual Defense Treaty. And some even told me, my interlocutors in Manila told me that one of the reasons why Manila was very quick in trying to de-escalate from that clash over Second Thomas Shaw was also because there were concerns that the US may not have their back. And so therefore, it will be extremely costly if they actually, get into some sort of an armed fight with China that could be potentially highly escalatory. That's one. The other thing that I heard about was that it took a little long for Manila to respond to that particular clash because there is some sort of a nearly 24-hour blackout before information came out. They hold a press conference, right? And there are some who told me that in that 24-hour blackout, it was actually consultations between Washington and Manila. And some were arguing that Washington might have, the Biden administration might have told Manila that, please don't escalate. So therefore, the decision is to pull back and to try to calm everything down. So this, I think, serves as a very illuminating lesson for all of us that, we can't be very sure of what those actors would do. And I guess for China's part, they're also not too certain as to whether the US might or might not take action. You may recall that in 2020, that was a few months before the election where Biden won and Trump lost his bid for re-election. There were concerns in China that Trump might potentially precipitate a conflict in the South China Sea in order to boost his chances to win the re-election. It didn't come to pass, but it actually got Beijing quite worried that Trump might do something. That was 2020. Fast forward to today, if anything, if Beijing has seen what Trump has done to Venezuela, for example, then and of course, even earlier when it comes to, the strike on Iran, then I think Beijing might come away with the impression that if Trump really want to push the button, if he threatened to push a button, he might, in the end, really push the button. So therefore, there will be a concern in Beijing that despite all the bluster and all the rhetoric from Trump, you still have to take him seriously, right? If he says that, don't bully the Philippines, then maybe, you might have to pay heed to that warning and be very, very circumspect about that. So that, I think, sums up what I will see as a first layer, broader geopolitical systemic issues. Now, the domestic issues, and I will focus on China. I think the key issue here is a debate between two lines of thoughts. One is the externalization line of thought. The theory of externalization will dictate that China, given its domestic problem, might seek a military adventure in order to divert attention, distract public attention, and even create what we call the rally around the flag effect around the CCP and Xi Jinping. That is one. The other, I think prospect theory will hold that given what is happening right now with all the gains that China have made over these decades of social economic development and liberalization, there are social problems right now in China with respect to, say, job issues, slowdown in the economy and all that. But still, after all, China remains a formidable economic machine, right? There's so much at stake. So the question is, will China risk going to war over those barren features in the South China Sea, and thereby risk, potentially devastating sanctions from the West, and potentially lead to further realignment in the region against China after that? So, and of course, that is one. The second issue is that if Taiwan is the main goal, why do you want to kick up a crisis in the South China Sea and then get the hornet's nest poked? So you want to save your energy. You don't want a distraction from your main goal, which is Taiwan, right? So therefore, maybe the South China Sea is secondary of importance. The main goal is Taiwan. So focus on preparing for that contingency, right? So then finally down to the man. And that creates further uncertainty because nobody knew exactly what Xi Jinping is up to. I mean, he keeps on saying that everything is about anti-corruption. But clearly, there is some sort of a cleansing up, purges of potential rivals in China. And the question is, if, say, right now, the Central Military Commission is now just down to him and Zhang Shengming, then basically there is no one who's going to advise him, right? There are many wiser people who look at China who will say that Zhang Youxia is the only adult in the room in the CMC because he's the one with the real combat experience. He is seasoned. He knows the potential pitfalls of getting into an armed conflict without proper preparation, right? So it really reminds me of what happened with Putin, right? That now, in the run-up to the war in Ukraine, Putin basically surrounded himself with yes men. The echo chamber is in large part driving him to make those judgments that led to the devastating consequence that we see today, right? So will that happen to China? My guess is that the risk is there, given what we saw in the case of Russia. If, say, Xi Jinping is cognizant of what Putin is undergoing, then maybe we may avert the risk. But the problem here is if he really believes that China or PR is ready for conflict, say in the South China Sea or over Taiwan, then probably nothing will stop him, right? So he will make the miscalculation. So what I do here is to list out all these three layers of systemic, domestic, and down to the individual factors in explaining the potential uncertainties over conflict. But in general, I will say, summing up everything, I think we do see a little bit more restraint on that. I tend to believe that the domestic problems in China might actually be a very, very important mitigating factor against the potential likelihood of a war in the South China Sea. And I will say, even add to that, Taiwan as a factor in ameliorating the risk of a conflict in the South China Sea because of what we assume to be China's predilection in Taiwan itself, he wouldn't want to be distracted from that objective. So all in all, I think for the South China Sea, we can be cautiously optimistic of the potential risk of an armed conflict, therefore.
You've commented before about the muscle and mediation approach in Beijing's South China Sea strategy. So the combination of coercion at sea and diplomatic narrative building. So how do you see the balance shifting in the last 2 or 3 years? Is it shifting towards more military muscle?
I think this shift started really somewhere around the COVID times. In fact, around the COVID, that was very interesting now. If we draw timelines, right, then one will argue that everything really started with Hu Jintao. I mean, he was one of the first to start to sort of elucidate more forcefully on asserting China's maritime sovereignty and rights. When Xi Jinping took over in 2012, the tone and language become much firmer. And in fact, one will call that even more assertive. So everything really, in general, started with Xi Jinping when he took power. And of course, we saw what happened in the very same year, the Scarborough Shoal incident with the Philippines. And thereafter, we saw a shift towards a more muscular posturing in the South China Sea with the island building exercise across 2013 all the way up till 2016. And then we see the gradual build up. And of course, you know, when COVID comes or in the run up to that, we saw China increasingly more assertive with its physical presence in the respective Southeast Asian claimants and even parties, if you want to call that, because Indonesia isn't really a claimant per se, but Indonesia was also subjected to the same coercion. That happened sometime around 2019. And of course, one will argue that COVID-19 might have a part to play in it. 2020 was the peak of more Chinese coercion against its Southeast Asian rivals in the South China Sea. Not just Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and then 1 year later, we reached Sun Reef, and that was ironic because it was Duterte administration. Everybody thought Duterte was very charming with Xi Jinping, right? But the Philippines was not spared from that either. So we saw, in fact, around COVID times, 2020 onwards, there's a gradual shift towards more muscular posturing in the South China Sea. So it doesn't mean that China has sort of stepped back from diplomacy. It still used diplomacy as a tool. But one will argue that China was increasingly much more evident in trying to sow greater division within ASEAN, I would say, over this period of time. We saw, on the one hand, China reinvigorating its interest on the code of conduct, which we are aware of. That was after the arbitral award came about. And the only reason is because China wanted to use the code of conduct to dilute the arbitral award that was issued in 2016. And in trying to shift the ASEAN agenda away by showing that it's keen to negotiate. And to China, the cause of the code of conduct falling apart, or whatever dismal or suboptimal form of the code of conduct wouldn't really affect China anyway, right? But still, China is pushing for that because it believes that it's one way to continue with the divide and conquer strategy on ASEAN itself. So we do see on that front some effort in that. But I think very, very evidently, over the recent years, we've seen a gradual shift in that towards muscular posturing. And I think the Philippines bore the brunt of the bulk of that increase in the muscular posturing. But at the same time, I do note that some of the Southeast Asian parties in the South China Sea were also pushing back. Not just the Philippines, but even Malaysia, Indonesia. They do that more cautiously. They don't do that the same way as the Philippines with assertive transparency. They still keep a low profile, but we still see them trying to push back on the maritime front. If they encounter Chinese Coast Guard vessel or naval vessels, they respond. They will send their naval vessels or Coast Guard vessels to challenge the Chinese presence and to assert themselves. We see, for example, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam pushing with their oil and gas activities in their EEZ, regardless of what China is saying. So I think this pushback is real. It's more subtle, and of course, growing state of exercises with foreign partners in around the South China Sea. The expansion of exercise Garuda Shield between Indonesia and US, it used to be bilateral. In the recent years, it expanded into multilateral exercise, Super Garuda Shield. Some of the expansion of exercises in the Philippines were the response to China, in fact. And this only happened with the blessing of the Southeast Asian countries, because while they do still want to maintain the buoyant relationship that is largely economic with China, they wanted to maintain that. They want to look at the big picture. But still, I struggle to see that they are trying to sacrifice on their own sovereignty and rights. And I think China knows that, which is why China is calibrating it more carefully. But still, overall, we see China becoming more muscular than anything else. I think that is largely meant to be a signal to the US and, of course, to the respective Southeast Asian parties, the South China Sea, that, you better be careful with what you are doing, because, we may resort to force. It's in a way a means to temper on what Southeast Asian countries could do, as a way to limit their freedom of action or options in the South China Sea more than anything else. Yeah.
Many commentators describe China's actions as gray zone tactics, just below the threshold of war. So from your perspective, where do you draw the line between gray zone coercion and outright armed aggression?
Wow. If we refer to gray zone, and of course, before gray zone came about, there has always been the other pre-existing definitions that were used. For example, hybrid threat, irregular warfare, whatever we call that, right? Gray zone largely refer to what we tend to call a set of short of war strategies that were used. Anything that falls under the threshold of war is termed gray zone. This term gray zone itself therefore remains an academically debatable term itself, because then where do we draw that line, as you highlighted? How do we define what is gray zone to begin with? Are we referring to the tactics? Are we referring to the effects? Or are we referring to the actors? Or are we referring to the tools that are being used, right? And if anything, the tools used might be ambiguous in this sense to qualify still as gray zone. But the actors are no longer gray, right? You are using outrightly state actors to do the job. You have China Coast Guard vessels, you have the maritime militia, they're out there in the South China Sea doing what they are doing. They are clearly not gray actors. They are using tactics that were under the threshold of armed conflict. They don't use kinetic force, for sure, yes. But still, where do you draw the line is hard. Which is why in the Philippines and the US, now they use these new terms they call ICAP, right? They call that illegal, coercive, aggressive, and deceptive as a way to describe these Chinese actions, which I tend to see as a bridge between what we try to call gray zone and outright military aggression or outright use of armed conflict, right? So I will see that as something that is much even more grayer than we thought, but still, I guess we see darker shades these days, right? Darker shades because now we are very clear who the actors are. And clearly the issue here is the action, the response of the respective countries. Now, don't get me wrong. These surrounding Southeast Asian countries, those who are involved in the South China Sea disputes, they do recognize that, these are clearly no longer gray actors. They are Chinese actors. They're using, tactics under the threshold of war, yes, but still they are very reticent in responding the way they ought to respond, because the common concern amongst them is that China is baiting them. So they don't want to fall into the Chinese trap. So if they believe that the Chinese are deliberately trying to trap them into precipitating an armed conflict, then they are assiduously trying to avoid that, therefore. So in some ways, that explains why they are extremely cautious when they respond to the Chinese maritime militia. They don't necessarily board those ships, apprehend those actors, and all they do usually is to just simply send their maritime forces, monitor them, and to show that there's a counter presence. And that seems to be what I see as the red line so far that they draw for themselves. Beyond that, there are concerns that it could be potentially escalatory, therefore. So to draw the line from the practical point of view, it is difficult. In the academic sense, it's still debatable. But what is clear is that at least we know that the actors are no longer gray. Therefore, yeah.
So you mentioned that Manila's approach is has quite maximum restraint, but isn't that euphemism for power imbalance? I mean, because the Philippines doesn't have the military power to actually counter the Chinese tactics.
In some ways, okay, in the most part, I agree with you. On the other hand, I think there's a shift in thinking on that. Of course, right now, the political atmosphere in Manila is that if you make defeatist comments about Manila's, standing up for its rights in the South China Sea, it is viewed to be unpatriotic. You understand right now there is an ongoing debate in Manila on the South China Sea, and that came about because of the world war with the Chinese embassy in Manila, right? So now there's a very vibrant conversation in Manila that is in fact quite interesting to note. It is politically unsound and incorrect if you try to say that, oh, we are a small country, so we can never stand up to China, so we should relinquish what we are fighting for, right? That is viewed with very negative perception in Manila right now, because if you look at the public surveys, clearly there is a huge consistency there. The public in general, writ large, is supportive of the ongoing policy towards China, meaning being more assertive towards China. But at the same time, there is certainly concern that they will go to war, which is why there is greater emphasis on diplomacy, but still demanding the administration to assert the national interest on the West Philippine Sea. So that, I think, it forms the backdrop of our understanding on that sort of perception that the Philippines has. You're right. This is a structural, systemic thing that won't go away. There is going to be continued asymmetry between the Philippines and China on that. The Gulf is too wide to begin with. And I will even argue that this is the same for any of the Southeast Asian parties in the South China Sea. They face the same asymmetry. And which is why I think they are trying to do two things. One is that they try to assert themselves with their own self-help. On the other hand, they hope that foreign partners and allies could help. In the case of the Philippines, they hope the US will continue to back them up if they have to go to war, right? They hope that it won't happen, for sure. But if they have to go to war, then they hope that the Americans will be there. If not, at least you have some moral support or material support from the other friends around the region, like Japan, Australia, France, for example, and other European countries. So I guess the Philippines is hoping that this will help to shift the power balance a little bit more towards its favor. We would call that proxy means of shifting the power balance, because after all, it isn't Philippines' own capabilities. It's using foreign capabilities to try to shift that power balance more towards its favor. But I think the most important thing the Philippines is doing right now isn't got to do with hard power itself, but more to do with the narrative, that the belief that domestically the narrative has to favor Manila, right? And I think to the most part, the current administration has succeeded in that. And of course, international narrative, which I think is still more geared towards the Philippine favor. On the other hand, we still see Manila trying to spruce up its physical presence. I think over these years, Manila has managed to build up its maritime forces to a certain degree that allow it some modicum of fighting back against China. So that counter presence is there. So in a nutshell, what I'm trying to respond to your question and your comment here is that you're right, the asymmetry is there. But I don't think Manila is sitting still and resigning its fate to that. I think it's trying to find alternate ways to address that asymmetry, therefore. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about United States' commitment to its defense agreement with the Philippines. How do you assess the U.S. current signaling around its defense commitment to the Philippines? Is it appropriately calibrated, or is it too vague, or is potentially escalatory in its own way?
Wow, this is a great question, Han, because during Duterte's time, there was a renewed interest on the Mutual Defense Treaty. because of concerns that the Mutual Defense Treaty, if you look at the text itself, is pretty vague, right? How do you define armed attack, for example? And how do you define the other prevailing conditions that will release them of their obligations of restraint, right? And then therefore respond to an armed attack of any sort. Now, the interesting thing over here is that what I hear were very conflicting stories about how they view the MDT, both from the American perspective as well as from the Filipino perspective. The Filipinos, we start with the Filipinos first. Some of them viewed the MDT as too ambiguous. So they wanted to clarify the terms of references that will give them a little bit more predictability as to whether the US will be committed to it, right? So there was the ongoing exercise to review the text of that treaty itself. And of course, we are also aware that even in the recent years, through these bilateral meetings at the highest defense levels, they have been trying to clarify and even make it very clear that if there's going to be an armed attack on any of the Filipino forces, whether you're talking about the armed forces or even the Coast Guard, then the US will respond to sort of its obligation to the treaty itself. Now, that's one part. The other part was that because the term armed attack is so vague itself, now there are two prevailing schools of thought. One is that it might actually be good to keep it ambiguous, because therefore, if you keep it ambiguous, you keep China on its toes, right? The other school of thought is you keep it ambiguous, China will keep pushing the boundaries. Over these years, since 2023, we have seen China increasingly expanding what it's doing against the Filipinos. Ramming actions, close maneuvers, laser pointing, water cannoning, and the water cannoning becomes increasingly more aggressive because people actually got hurt because of the water cannon, right? So China is pushing the boundary, and it's quite clear that China is trying to push to test the limits of the MDT. He's trying to find out what exactly were the parameters that could work around in order to prevent invoking the MDT, right? And the Filipinos were in some ways withstanding that because they do not want to unnecessarily invoke the MDT. But what I hear from Americans is that the onus is more on the Filipinos, not on them, actually. For the Americans, they were more liberal in defining what armed attack is. To them, armed attack, if you look at the Indo-PACOM J06 document that were released, it's a legal document on Sierra Madre. They update that quite frequently, but the last update was actually after the last clash. So they actually try to define what armed attack is, and they refer that to an illegal attack. And an illegal attack could actually be two types: kinetic, non-kinetic. So kinetic will mean the use of firearms. Non-kinetic is anything below that, which includes ramming, water cannoning. So in other words, what the Americans were trying to put forth here is there are already legal conditions or preconditions that were laid out in qualifying for US to help if the Filipinos were under attack. And what the Filipinos had been subjected to would actually have long qualified the Americans to do that. So now the question is, why haven't they invoked the MDT? Therefore, so what I tend to see here is the Filipinos trying to shift the goalposts over time, because since 2023, we have seen the Filipinos shifting the goalposts when it comes to invoking the MDT. First, they say that if a Filipino is being injured or being killed, then they will invoke MDT. Then subsequently, when things escalated with China, they changed that again. Because people got injured, right? Then they say that, okay, then the new condition here is if, somebody got seriously injured, then the question is, what do you mean by being seriously injured, right? How do you qualify that, right? And then after that, under public domestic pressure, they, after that, qualify it the third time to say that, okay, if Filipinos are on the brink of dying, and I think that referred to the 2023 August incident around Sabina Shore with that lone Coast Guard vessel, because there were no resupply and there were concerns that they're dying out, right? So they keep shifting the goalposts somehow. So that led me to come to the realization that while the Americans do have a set of legal preconditions that they lay out very precisely as to what would qualify for the use of force in retaliation against China, but it appeared that Manila has been a key limiting factor. Manila is very concerned about whether or not the Americans will come to their help if they actually push for that to begin with, and whether or not it will actually be called a bluff. Because what China might be doing right now is to try to see whether the Americans and the Filipinos would act. If push comes to shove, if they don't act, then essentially China will call a bluff. The MDT falls apart. The MDT will remain successful and effective so long as it doesn't get invoked somehow, right? Which is an irony here. So in other words, keeping it ambiguous might not be a bad thing. If you keep it too prescriptive, it might potentially limit the options for the Filipinos and the Americans. In other words, their options to de-escalate, their options to qualify those conditions for armed attack to take place. So I will say that keeping it ambiguous might not be a bad thing, but on the other hand, it will mean that the Filipinos will have to brace for more from China, therefore. How long it could last against China is a big question. On the other hand, I think China will also understand that since the second Thomas Shaw clash, I think it is very instrumental in highlighting to China the limits of how much it can push, therefore. So after which, I think what we see here is basically a very stable situation right now, where China is pushing its maritime forces in, showing presence, but not exactly trying to replicate what happened back in second Thomas Shaw because of the potential risk of inviting the US to be involved. So in some ways, you argue the MDT in its current form actually worked, which is ironic in a way. Yeah.
So Donald Trump has openly talked about annexing Greenland and annexing Canada, and talk about taking over Venezuelan oil asset. Actually, the United States are already done so, and they're selling Venezuelan oil. Yeah. And he's also planning to attack Iran. So isn't the US simply confirming what China has claimed all along, that the United States is imposing its own hegemony over the world and with no regard to national sovereignty? So if the United States gets to do what it wants, what it thinks in its own national interest, why can't China behave in the same way, especially considering China's growing military power and economic power?
A great question, Han. This is a question or an issue that isn't very recent, to be honest. Look, if you think back in the Cold War, for example, the US had engaged in military interventions around the world, right, that people don't like. That's what they call Uncle Sam, right? Uncle Sam policing the world based on his own will. There weren't Donald Trump back then, but still the US would not hesitate to use force to change the status quo to its liking as and when it wants it to be. Panama is a good example back in the 1980s. The case of the Iraq War in 2003, regime change and all that. Nothing new, to be honest. So what I tend to see is Beijing or people in China rehashing a very old argument, in fact, right? That what Donald Trump is doing right now is essentially a continuation of what the US tends to be doing. But then back then, if you recall, is that despite all that, the US is often seen to be still at least on the net a benign hegemon at least to this part of the world. Maybe not to Latin America because of the moral doctrine, right? But at least to Southeast Asia, to Asia in general, the US is commonly seen as a stabilizing force more than anything else. Because after all, the US is not a resident power in this part of the world, in the Western Pacific. It is a far way across the Pacific Ocean. And they rely on the US to provide security and to anchor regional stability. I don't think that's changed. But here comes the moral question, because in the Philippines, after what's happened in Venezuela, there are those in the Philippines who argue and they question whether it is in fact wise to continue to rely on the US because of what US has done in Venezuela. US might have lost its moral authority in the South China Sea, therefore. So there has been murmurs on that, but in general, in Manila, there is a greater positive perception towards the fact that, okay, what happened with Greenland, what happened in Venezuela, what happened with Canada is one thing. but still in this part of the world, the US is still seen as pretty benign, right? The US is still regarded as a partner more than anything else. So I don't think that really has cut the ice when it comes to what Beijing is trying to put forward as a narrative that, no, just because Americans were doing that, why are we being criticized and Americans are not being criticized, right? Because simply it's got to do geography. I would say that the geography dictates that the US will not be seen as in the same light as a threat to the Asian countries, the way that China is being seen as a threat or a challenge to its neighbors, therefore. So it is what I will tend to see as a false binary that China is putting forth here, which I think regional countries are more discerning these days. So that narrative didn't seem to pan out, I would say, at least in Singapore. There's only concern that given what the US is doing under Trump, it undermines international order for sure. It undermines the sanctity of rule of law. But then again, we're deceiving ourselves here. Because all this while, over the past decades, right, it's quite clear that the rule of law or rule of international law is pretty much a chimera. It is in as much effective if you can enforce it. And we all know that it's unenforceable, at least for the major powers, right? So I'm not trying to sort of defend the US in trying to say that. What I'm trying to put forth here is that it's not a new phenomenon. And these arguments were as old as many decades back, and it's rehashed again by China. And I think regional countries, they are more cognizant of their own realities than to simply just buy the Chinese argument.
You mentioned before that narrative building can matter as much as island building. So referencing Beijing's efforts around features like the Sandy Cay, which South China Sea claimant, which country in your view has done the best job of strategic communication and positioning, and which country has been lagging behind, do you think?
If anything, I would say that the one country that has been doing that very well, besides China, is Vietnam. Vietnam has been extremely consistent in its strategic communications. And of course, one will argue that that has a lot more to do with the fact that Vietnam has a pretty, interesting political system, right? Because it has the same political system as China. So it is much more able to do that. It is much more able to put forth a unified strategic communications protocol than most other parties in the South China Sea, in Southeast Asia. Look at the Philippines, for example, and I'll refer that to the Duterte administration back then. In those 6 years, it was a disaster when it comes to strategic communications on the South China Sea. Under Duterte administration, we've seen more confusion from Manila than anything else. Look, you have more than 5 actors back then, at least 5 actors in Manila who will talk about the South China Sea in public. You have, for example, the presidential spokesman. He will be the one talking about South China Sea. You have the Foreign Affairs Secretary who will talk about South China Sea. You'll have the National Security Advisor talk about South China Sea. You'll have the Defense Secretary to talk about South China Sea. Then sometimes you'll have even some of the legal consultants for the government talk about South China Sea. And then you have Duterte himself talk about South China Sea. Sometimes they don't talk on the same language at all. They sometimes contradict themselves. So if anything, back then the Philippines under Duterte might have been the weakest when it comes to strategic communication. Now it's improving. There is greater unity on that. So I will tend to say that the Manila is probably catching up on Vietnam when it comes to putting forth a more unified strategic communications posture on the South China Sea. Vietnam is still the strongest of all, but amongst the others, I will see Indonesia and Malaysia in some ways not faring very well sometimes because of the inconsistencies that keep coming out of their capitals. That, while it appears that only a few actors are propagating the strategic communications, but what they say to their own domestic public and what they say outwardly might sometimes be very different, right? For example, in the Malaysian parliamentary debates, they will talk about, say, the Chinese Coast Guard vessel that is, almost 24/7 anchored in South Luconia shore of Sarawak in their EEZ, and they will start to question why is it there. And then you'll have, of course, the policy elites who are trying to sort of gloss over the fact that they aren't really capable of pushing out the Chinese. So they argue that, oh, well, because we respect freedom of navigation. It's like, okay, so use that argument to say that the Chinese have every right to be there, right? So therefore, it does confuse the public a little bit. And it does also confuse the external audience that, why are you using FON as an argument to justify the Chinese presence on the one hand, and then you are trying to therefore show that you are concerned about the Chinese presence by sending your forces there. So I guess on the part of Indonesia and Malaysia, that's deliberate maybe because they wanted to show that they are after all more concerned about the big picture with their ties with China. But on the other hand, it does cause some confusion to both domestic and external audience. So I wouldn't call them the weakest link, but I will argue and be more diplomatic to say that they could do it better in terms of the language they use and be more precise in the terms they use, especially the legal terms they use in justifying their actions and their views of the Chinese presence in their waters.
In terms of submarine proliferation and amphibious forces and naval modernization in Southeast Asia, which capability trends are you worried most from an escalation point of view? Submarines, missiles, or something else?
I guess submarines will still be a key concern here. Reason mainly being that we have very underdeveloped mechanisms for confidence and security building in this realm. Look, we have, for example, Corps of Unplanned Encounters at Sea, CUES, right? We have COREX that is, of course, applied to all international seafarers. And of course, we have other ongoing efforts to try to create equivalent mechanisms for coast guards and all that. But on submarines, on undersea, that is a problem. And that is now increasingly more complicated given, of course, the renewed or emerging threat in the maritime and the undersea domain relating to critical undersea infrastructure like cables, pipelines. Now you have submarines still a problem, and we don't have mechanisms that could allow us to ameliorate the threat or the potential risks. All we have here are mitigating mechanisms. For example, if submarines get into an accident or emergency, there are mechanisms to mobilize help for the submariners. We have ongoing exercises to sort of drill all these contingencies. But we have nothing in the way of, say, what we call water space management or prevention of mutual interference between submarines. We have no such equivalent or analog mechanisms similar to what we see in the case of NATO or in the West. So because of that, I would tend to see that these trends remain a key concern of all the naval modernization trends, largely because what we are seeing here is right now, not just submarines being acquired in the region are bigger and more powerful in terms of their latent capabilities. In fact, we are looking at bigger submarines. They are more ocean going. Many of them equipped with propulsion that allow them to stay underwater for prolonged periods of time. Non-nuclear options like AIP, for instance, either Stirling or fuel cell technology, and even lithium technology as well. And of course, bigger payloads that include unmanned systems. One will argue that the use of unmanned systems paired with submarines in that sort of unmanned-manned teaming protocol might actually ameliorate the risk. I'm not too sure whether it really will happen, because if you look at what happened around in the region, we have seen increasing instances of drones, undersea drones, being retrieved by the locals. And that could potentially be a cause of diplomatic uproar and the cause of diplomatic tensions, therefore. So with all this in mind, I tend to see the undersea realm as the biggest concern. And in large part also because we really have no prevailing mechanisms that could actually prevent or mitigate all these consequences.
Australia has signed a nuclear submarine program agreement with the United States and Great Britain. How does that affect the thinking in Southeast Asian countries in terms of the arms race over submarine development? China is, of course, opposed to AUKUS. What's the attitude of Southeast Asian countries, including Singapore and Indonesia and the Philippines, towards the AUKUS agreement?
So it was interesting because if you recall when it was first announced in September 2021, it created a huge uproar. Indonesia especially was a little miffed about it because before the announcement, they actually had a high-level meeting and they weren't told or given any heads up about that. So they were a little bit miffed by that. And that I think that sort of partly explains why Indonesia come out with pretty strong statements after that, together with Malaysia. The Philippines was pretty much welcoming of it. Singapore was pretty much welcoming of it. Vietnam appeared to be very ambivalent about it. The rest of the Southeast Asian countries don't really make statements out of AUKUS at all. So in general, there were concerns relating to the potential arms race that will come about. And of course, the question about nuclear proliferation, because of questions surrounding the type of nuclear fuel that the AUKUS submarines will use. Are they low enriched uranium or are they highly enriched uranium, right? So these were latent concerns that were being put forth, and it was pretty consistent. To be honest, those criticisms that come from Malaysia and Indonesia in particular about AUKUS were expected because they were roughly the same concerns that were shared by most of the Southeast Asian countries. The only difference is that Indonesia and Malaysia sort of elucidate them more openly and more vocally. That is the only concern. But generally, I think gradually over the recent years after that, some things change. The Australians actually put in a lot of effort going around the region in trying to brief regional governments on AUKUS and clarifying the questions that they have, which is why over these years, there were gradual easing of those concerns about nuclear proliferation because of the IAEA safeguards that may come about. And of course, there were also some amelioration of concerns about the potential arms race. Now, the term arms race, to me, honestly, is a sort of a non-starter for Southeast Asia because we wouldn't expect any Southeast Asian countries to therefore start to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. There are, of course, technological, environmental, political, and financial and technical reasons why this will not happen in Southeast Asia. So if anything, any response to AUKUS is likely more asymmetric. In other words, it will be tit for tat in terms of the same equipment. It will be, say, investing in prevailing anti-submarine or undersea detection capabilities, anti-submarine assets on the surface and even in the air, probably acquisition of more conventional submarines. That is the best that we can acquire in Southeast Asia. So these are the prevailing response. In an arms race, there's no way Southeast Asia could match up with, say, China, Australia, or any of the other stronger powers around the region. But what we tend to see is another concern right now. Since 2021, there is concern about whether, therefore, it means that we have more nuclear-powered submarines that will traverse our waters. I think Singapore isn't so concerned about that because we make it very public that we welcome AUKUS submarines to call into Singapore's ports. And we make it very clear that we welcome AUKUS submarines in the same spirit as we welcome American nuclear subs that call into, say, Changi Naval Base, right? So there's no difference here. We don't discriminate. But then again, Indonesia has concerns because they have concerns about nuclear power submarines traversing their archipelagic waters. So there were concerns, for example, in the region about what's going to happen if there's a war over Taiwan. What will happen to these waterways? Should we impose some restraint or constraints on the belligerents, right? Including Australia potentially, the US and China, and of course, whether or not we could really stay neutral, or whether it's even possible feasibly to even close those waterways to these belligerents to begin with. You reminded me of my experience in Jakarta back in August 2023. I remember it was not really a conference on that, but I remember my sideline private conversation with senior officials from the Indonesian government. They were asking about whether it is high time for ASEAN countries. And bear in mind, back then, Indonesia was the ASEAN chair, and there was a few months left before he has to relinquish it to the next party, right? Indonesia was thinking about whether there should be some form of conversations within ASEAN on at least some form of coordination or synchronization on how we will impose certain restrictions on the use of the waterways, or even calibrate on the way we expect international users to treat those waterways if they want to invoke their freedoms and their rights to use those waterways to begin with. Because put it this way, regional countries have differing interpretations of UNCLOS, right? So there were concerns also about whether if you close the waterways to any belligerent, then therefore will you be seen as party to the conflict itself? So what I'm trying to put forth here is that the arms race, nuclear proliferation concerns were more of the case in the early years immediately preceding the announcement in 2021. But in the more recent years, it's given way to something much more uncertain, which is the potential military use of the waterways in Southeast Asia by the nuclear submarines and other military forces, and how Southeast Asian countries could respond to those contingencies, therefore.
You mentioned in a possible conflict over Taiwan between United States and China.
Yeah.
So if that conflict does happen, what's Singapore's role in it? What's the discussion in Singapore about how will Singapore respond? How do they participate or not?
I recall that there was one interesting interview with one of our very senior diplomats, which I don't want to name who, being asked about the case of Taiwan. And I think that there are two key takeaways based on the response from the diplomat. One is that we don't subscribe to the policy of neutrality, right? Because very often the term neutrality is being floated around, is being often used as a sort of an escape clause, right? By countries when they are confronted with that question, they say, oh, we'll be neutral. Then my question is, what do you mean by neutral, right? Because if your interests are being impinged upon, are you really able to stay neutral to begin with, right? So the question is, how do you define neutrality? In Singapore's case, we don't subscribe to the term neutrality. We subscribe to national interests, and all our responses to contingencies will be conditioned on national interest to begin with. That's one. Second is that it really depends on who starts the conflict, right? So whoever starts the conflict will be in the wrong, and so we'll take sides appropriately, therefore. So these are the two key takeaways that I draw from that interview, which I believe to be pretty much representative of the Singapore government's position. And here's the catch here, because on the one hand, we have close economic and diplomatic ties with China, right? We do subscribe to the one China policy, but here, we actually host American military forces in Changi Naval Base, Paya Lebar Air Base. Sembawang Wharf is the site for Commonwealth Westpac, which is going to play a key logistics role in any conflict in the region, right? And the bigger question here is, can Singapore afford to therefore say we are neutral and therefore we don't welcome the Americans? You are out. We are not going to allow you to facilitate your logistics arrangement for a conflict over Taiwan, and you can never call into Singapore's naval base. You cannot use our air bases as well. You have no overflight rights as well, and all that. If that happens, I think there are key consequences. We have close military and security ties with the US. For example, our Air Force is highly dependent on the US. Just look at our combat aviation. The entire combat aviation is American, right? And air power is instrumental for national survival. So essentially, what we are trying to tell the Americans is that we vested our national survival in you, right? And all these interoperability exercises that we conduct with the Americans mean something. They're just not for show. If need be, they might potentially be invoked for use. They may come in handy for any contingency, which I don't want to name what potential contingencies. But what I'm trying to tell you here, Han, is that I don't think it's straightforward to say that because of a Taiwan Strait conflict, we thereby invoke the position of neutrality. I don't think it's as simple as that. Potentially, we might play a role, but if anything, I'm quite sure that we won't play a direct combat role in the case of Taiwan. That is one. Second complication, I believe you have read this Asia Times article that was written by some Singapore Armed Forces recruit about Singapore and the case of Taiwan. I have many holes to poke on the article because some of the premises were just flawed and just not well considered. But then again, we do have forces in Taiwan who are undergoing training. I myself, personally, I went to Taiwan twice for my national service. And I think I'm quite sure to say that this will be a concern as well in times of conflict. Then what will be the role played by these forces in Taiwan? How are we able to pull them out? And of course, the other broader regional concern is that, as you know, Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia, Philippines, even Vietnam have a pretty sizable presence in Taiwan. They have workers there, migrant workers in Taiwan. So if there's going to be a conflict in Taiwan, then the question here is, how are we able to evacuate them to safety, right? So then there are people who are proposing Singapore as the potential hub for this sort of evacuation operation, what we call non-combatant evacuation operations, because Singapore is hosting the regional HADR coordinating center in Changi, and they hope that maybe that could be one potential avenue to use, because after all, it's a humanitarian assistance issue, right? So HADR encompasses NEO. So therefore, Singapore could play a role in coordinating a potential NEO on Taiwan that is more regional among Southeast Asian countries. Then, of course, the question is, how do we coordinate with our regional neighbors like the Philippines? Because if anything, besides Japan, the other closest avenue for evacuation with the Philippines, Luzon area, right? And the bigger question here is, if there's going to be a war in Taiwan, can northern Philippines be spared for the conflict to begin with, right? If the Philippines is dragged into conflict, then it means that the Philippines is out. Then we may have to think about alternate avenues for evacuation, and Singapore may have to play that role. So what I'm trying to put forth to you here is that Singapore's role is both political as well as practical and operational in that sense. It's probably not so controversial when we talk about evacuations, right? But it's very controversial when we talk about Singapore's role in support of US combat or military operations over Taiwan. And in that sense, I don't think there's a clear-cut answer. I wouldn't want to say that we will stay neutral. It really depends greatly on the circumstance by which it leads to conflict to begin with.
Last question. So if you say you play a role of advisor to the Chinese government and the Philippine government, what advice would you give to the two governments to help solve the current crisis in South China Sea?
The very commonly given advice is, okay, please engage in dialogue. I mean, it's so boring, it's so tiresome to keep hearing people say that engage in dialogue, engage in joint development and all that. These are well-intentioned counsel, but then again, it tends to avoid addressing the root of the problem here. Now, the problem here is that these two governments are not going to roll back very easily, because the positions are entrenched in large part because of domestic reasons, right? In the case of China, clearly, the population is conditioned to believe that China has undeniable and indisputable rights to the South China Sea. The South China Sea is referred to as the blue ancestral homeland, or they call 蓝色祖国. And therefore, if it's 蓝色祖国, it is ancestral. There's no way you could concede that. But here's a catch. For the CCP, I think it's in a better position to take an off-ramp, right? It's in a better position to reshape the public narrative around it. It is not the same as any other democratic societies where, you potentially get into trouble if you suggest to roll back. Therefore, I'm not trying to suggest here that China has to take the brunt of all the actions, obviously. But here, I think China, the Chinese government, the Chinese leadership could reconsider its position on the South China Sea, softening it, rolling back, revising the scope of its claim. And in fact, there could be a way out to that, right? In fact, it might not be damning for the Chinese government to agree that maybe adhering to international law is not a bad thing for China. Because if China wants to be a global actor, then maybe on the moral standpoint, it is good to adhere to international law. And I think the CCP could find ways and means to reshape that narrative to that effect. So this is what I would advise the Chinese government. Do something to it. Take that risk, take the leap, and try to see whether it is possible to reshape public opinion in China towards a more moderate position on the South China Sea. And over time, it is possible to do that, I believe. In the case of the Philippines, I guess one thing to note is it's important to get your house in order. It is a democracy, right? And as a democracy, it comes with all the attendant problems of a democracy, which is multiple stakeholders, multiple opinions, and therefore the tendency to have a very, very vibrant debate. It is good to have a debate, but then again, you need to have your house in order by bringing everyone on the same page, therefore. And that, I mean, it will require the Philippine government to at least do something when it comes to national education. This is something that is raised recently, in fact, because in the Congress, there were some interested parties who argue that it's high time for the government to try to institute education on the West Philippine Sea. I agree. On the other hand, I think it's also important to stress upon the very basic ethos of international law and the basic ethos about cooperation as well. Because the concern here I have is if the Philippines entrench itself even further, it might gradually find itself having less leeway to play, right? It sort of get boxed into the same conundrum as what China is experiencing right now, therefore. So how do you try to draw that balance between asserting your rights and trying to put forth the option to cooperate with the other party who you don't like, therefore? So I guess on the part of the Philippines, there's also quite a bit that it could do in the long term.
All right. Thanks very much, Colin, for your time and for your insight.
Yeah, thank you, Han. I know it's very late, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share my views. And of course, I will welcome you to get in touch again. If you don't want a sort of recording, it's fine. I mean, we can always have an offline discussion on these issues. And I look forward to seeing you in person in time to come.
All right. Of course. Yeah, we'll keep in touch.
Keep in touch, okay? And I wish you a happy and prosperous Year of the Horse and a good weekend.
Same to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, okay? Yeah.